Okay. Since this quarantine started, I've probably given out this recipe about 25 times, and I've spent numerous hours on the phone and email and text on how to do this. So we're just going to make this video and send it to the next few people who ask. And in any community you live in, you're probably going to be responsible for a shortage of yeast, because everyone's going to do it once they see how easy this is. The recipe is a New York Times recipe. Mark Bittman, who was a food reviewer for the New York Times, went to visit Jim Leahy, I believe, at the Sullivan Street Bakery, and he put this recipe out there, and I know it's the #1 downloaded recipe from the New York Times. I do it a little differently, but it's worth it for you to download this New York Times no-knead bread recipe and, read it and look at it, and then at that point you can start modifying it for yourself. You could add olives, you could add raisins, you could add cranberries, you could do half whole wheat, you could add beer. There's so many varieties, it's amazing. I'm going to stress the simpleness of this by not being careful about my measurements, just to show you how forgiving this recipe is. It's very hard to not get it right. And the results are kind of the best bread you ever had. All right, so it starts with 3 cups of flour. And I'll just put, basically I'm just doing it by eye. 1, 2, 3. By the way, I usually put this up before I go to bed at night because it's going to have to sit for 12 hours. So it takes me about 10 minutes to do this. 3 cups of flour. I use rapid rise yeast. Now the recipe calls for 1/4 of a teaspoon. I started using 1/2 of a teaspoon a couple of years ago, and I've stayed with it. So I just take 1/2 teaspoon, put it in. If you use the packets of the rapid rise yeast, it's fine. Just open the packet and use 1/2 teaspoon. And that's all the yeast you'll need. And then 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I use kosher salt. This is 1/2 teaspoon, so I'll do 3 of these. That's it. And then you give it a gentle stir just to mix the ingredients together. Now the only other thing that's going to be added to this is 1.5 cups of hot water. The hot water from your tap is about 120 degrees, which is perfect. If the water's too cold, it's not going to activate the yeast. And actually, if the water's over, I think 130, it actually could kill the yeast. So what I do is I'll just go to the sink, let the hot water run until it's really hot, just to my finger touch, which is about now. I'm just going to take 1.5 cups of water, which is now. I'll let it just sit for a minute. I'm right on. I'll make a little well in the middle of the flour. I'm using a rubber spoon. I'll pour the water in. And all you want to do now is make sure all of the flour is going to be wet. And you don't want any dry spots. So mix it until you have no patches of flour. This ends up being not a typical bread dough if you're used to making bread. It's almost more of a batter. If you've ever made a biscuit, which is kind of a lot thinner than a bread, get underneath, make sure you get all of the flour wet. If you don't do that now, you'll get little patches of flour inside your loaf, which of course you don't want. Okay, once it's mixed like that, I take the excess off with my finger. You could use a knife or something. And then I cover it with saran wrap. Like that. And it's going to, and then if you have a kitchen, you don't want to put it in the terrible cold, but if you have any kind of dish towel, I put a towel over it, and I just let it sit 12 hours. And it could be up to 16 or 18 hours. It's not critical. You're just going to leave it here on your counter. You're going to go to bed. When you wake up, you're going to do the rest. That's part one. Thank you. Okay, this is kind of part two. Now, you'll see I'm cheating a little because the bowl's going to be a little different. Because actually, I put this one up last night about 7 o'clock. It's 10:30 now, so it's about 15 hours. So here's what it's going to look like after 15 hours. And as I said, it's kind of more of a batter than a dough. You want to see these bubbles. It kind of will smell. It smells a little yeasty. If you look through this, you'll see all of those air bubbles, I hope. This is pretty much exactly what you want it to look like. And that's why this is the notion of self-rising. It's risen from the dough into this batter. What we do now is we're going to put this towel down. I'm going to flour the surface. We don't want to knead it. Of course, it's a no-knead recipe. But we want to fold it 4 or 6 times. So I'm going to just spread out a little flour here. I'm going to use this, and I'm going to pour it out onto the flour. Now here, you see these strands? That's all gluten. That's what you want. Of course, unless you're non-gluten, but that's the good stuff. That's the bread right there. That's what makes this so incredible. Okay, so I'm taking it out of the... Okay, and then Janet will warn you not to dump all this extra dough into the sink. I've already cost us about $1,000 in plumbing bills by putting dough down the drain. So try to clean this out and throw it in your garbage can, and don't flush it down your drain. Unless you live in an apartment building, then you don't have to care.
That's not
Okay,
true.
I know it's not true. So now I'm going to put a little flour on the top and on my hands. And I'm just going to grab up the sides and fold it once, fold it twice, fold it 3 times, and fold it 4 times. And after I fold it 4 times, I'm going to turn it over and make it into a ball. Now, the recipe calls for putting out some cornmeal onto your towel, putting the ball on top of the cornmeal, which kind of gives it a bottom so the bottom doesn't burn, and then we leave it covered and we let it sit for 1 hour. I've been doing it that way, but going from this towel to my oven, which is not very far, I usually get cornmeal all over the floor and flour all over the floor. So I've kind of got into the habit now, saving the housework, whereas I'll put down a piece of parchment paper, and rather than put the dough ball onto a towel, I'll put it on the parchment paper. I'll put out the cornmeal there. That's about the size of the ball. If you don't have cornmeal, you could use oatmeal. You could use wheat germ, anything. You're basically doing this so eventually when the dough goes into a pot, it's not going to stick to the bottom. It's going to give it a bottom. So now that I have my cornmeal there, I'm going to flip the ball on it. Take a little flour, put it onto the top, rub it so the towel doesn't stick, and then we let it sit here for 1 hour. And it's actually going to rise again. It's going to probably approximately double in size. I'll show it to you when the time comes. Let me just tell you something about what else is going to happen here. This has to sit for 1 hour, but after a half hour, I'll preheat the oven to 500 degrees. And so this way, when the 1 hour is up, the bread will be ready and I'll go right in the oven. Now these breads get cooked in a cast iron pot. It could be Le Creuset, it could be, there's like 20 other brands, or you could use cast iron. The only thing you need to consider is, since the bread gets cooked at 500 degrees, you want to make sure the knob on top can tolerate that. The typical knob that comes with Le Creuset is this black one. And after doing some research, that black one's only good up to like 375 degrees, and then it will start to melt. So if you're going to use a Le Creuset or some other brand, just make sure the knob could tolerate a 500 degree temperature. And when the oven is ready, and you'll see this, I'll be putting this in here. You want the pot to preheat in the oven at the 500 degrees. So in 1 hour, my dough will be ready, my pot will be ready, the oven will be ready, and we'll show you how we get that from there to there. That could be the end of this section.
Behind you, Grandma.
Yeah, Allah's right behind you.
Yeah.
All right, so it's an hour. The pot is in the oven, which has been preheated to 500 degrees. Here's how the bread looks after sitting for an hour. You can see it's doubled in size. Now I score it before I put it in the oven. You could just put it in this way and it will naturally break, but it kind of looks a little more professional if you put 3 scores in it, like I do, just like that. Now it used to be a whole dance to get this bread into the oven, and I'd get flour everywhere. So as I said earlier, I'm going to leave it on this parchment paper. I'm going to open the oven. Of course the pot's really hot, 500 degrees. I'm going to put it there. I'm going to open it. I'm going to put the bread in, paper and all, parchment paper, just like that. I'm going to get the lid back on. And it's going to cook now with the lid on for 30 minutes, and then 15 minutes with the lid off. So I'll come back in about 30 minutes and we'll take a look at it. Thank you. All right, it's 30 minutes. Timer just went off. I'm going to open the oven. I'm going to tell you, I usually light incense, but on bread days, you don't have to light incense. The house smells unbelievable. So I take off the lid. And here's what, I don't usually do this, but here's what the bread looks like now. Pretty beautiful. But the last 15 minutes is really about the crust and getting a nice, rich color to the bread. Truth is, the bread's pretty much cooked at this point. So, although the recipe calls for 15 minutes, I pretty much stand by the oven. Sometimes I'll take it out at 9 minutes. I've never gone longer than 15. But actually I've really gone to 15. It's usually 9 or 12 minutes, but I set my timer to 15, but I pretty much stand here for the 15 minutes. I don't want it to burn, but I want to get a really nice crust on the bread. So I'll set the timer, and then I'll come back to you as I'm taking out the bread. Thank you. So it's only been 12 minutes, but I've been keeping my eye on it. And I'm going to take it out now. I don't want it to burn. It looks absolutely perfect. And what we do now, since it's in the paper, I don't think you could hear it on the video, but the bread likes to crackle, and to me that's an important ingredient. When you hear the crackling, it's the bread's telling you, I'm ready, I'm ready. Anyway, we'll take the bread out of the pot, and then looking pretty beautiful.
Yeah,
I'm going to put it onto a wire rack to cool. Now in a household, if you're alone, you could properly cool it, I'd say 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours. But if there's other people in the house, I doubt you're going to get away with letting it cool that long, because everyone just wants to have a piece right now with some butter on it. But I'm going to let it cool for about an hour or so. And the last thing I'd want to show you actually is how I cut. I don't know, it's for some reason, many people don't know how to cut a round bread. So I will go over cutting the bread with you. And well, the last thing I should show you in this section is this sound you could hear. Listen to this. That's the hollow sound. That's the sound you want to hear. That's telling you the bread's done and the bread's cooked just right. Here's how the bottom looks, by the way, with all that cornmeal on it. This is just a beautiful loaf. So we'll let it cool and we'll come back to you soon. Okay, well here's our beautiful loaf. It has a great crust. And here's how we're going to cut it. And what I do, you don't have to do it this way, but I first cut it in half. Listen to that crust. This is amazing. And it smells incredible. Hollow's going to get the first taste.
Can we all smell it?
First, let me show you the crumb. Look at this. That's called the crumb. You get a beautiful, airy texture. How's that smell, Alla? Pretty
Can
good.
T-Rex
Let's
smell
have
it?
T-Rex. He loves it.
She does.
She loves it, I mean. Sorry. And now, when I cut it in half, I slice it this way. Because it's very hard making these long slices. So we cut it like this.
This can be my piece.
There's your piece. Give it a taste. What do you think?
Good.
Good. Now, some people like butter, some people don't. Now I'll see if Janet, the camera woman, wants that to give it a taste. Now the bread's still a little warm, so that butter's just gonna melt into it. Here she goes. Andra, do you want a piece?
Yep.
Yup. What do you? That's a country yup.
T-Rex is eating my piece.
Okay, and here goes Andra's piece. The bread's still warm. You know what happens if the bread's too warm, it gets a little mushy inside. So you can, of course, just let it cool a little longer. But
Thank you.
as I said earlier, it's very hard to keep this bread around too long because people are just going to want it, eat it, and it goes pretty quick. So that's it. Very simple. It's very forgiving. I don't think you will get inferior results. Maybe sometimes it won't rise as high. Sometimes it might be darker or lighter. But I'll have to tell you, I bet the first time you do this, it's going to come out perfect. Good luck. Happy bread baking.